Evelyn Harper Cole didn't lose everything in one day. Richard Cole had taken exactly 18 months to dismantle her life, cleanly, quietly, every move legal on paper. By the time he filed for divorce, the house no longer carried her name. The savings had vanished from every account she'd ever known, and 32 years spent holding up his life, standing behind his career, building his world, all of it reduced to a figure so small it felt like a slap. What she walked away with was an old car, a handful of personal belongings, and $21,000. 3 weeks later, Evelyn spent nearly every cent of that money on an abandoned restaurant nobody wanted. Not a soul understood the decision. Perhaps she didn't fully understand it herself, but some choices get made when a person has absolutely nothing left to lose. And those are precisely the choices that change everything. If you've ever wondered what happens when a woman stripped of everything still refuses to stop moving forward, stay until the end. And if stories like this speak to you, subscribe to the channel to support us. Because what waited for Evelyn inside that old kitchen was far more than dust and darkness and forgotten things. Evelyn Harper Cole stood at the threshold of the back room behind the kitchen for nearly 2 minutes. She did not cross it. The door hung open already, but her body held that last distance, as though one more step would carry her into something she wasn't prepared to name. She'd come to measure the kitchen space again, to take notes. What could be salvaged? What needed tearing out? The small notebook was still in her hand, a few scrawled lines of numbers and question marks. Not a single line mentioned this room, but the room was there, and she had opened it. The smell inside wasn't just dust. Something older lived in it, something deeper, like air that hadn't been stirred in years, holding whatever had been sealed within it for too long. The light from the kitchen stretched partway across the floor and then quit, as if it too refused to go further. Everything beyond that edge was drowned in pale gray. Broken chairs piled on top of each other, a dented metal cabinet, cardboard boxes gone soft at every corner, their edges chewed away by time and damp. 8 years. That's what the seller had told her. This place had been shuttered for 8 years. Nobody had set foot in this room during all of it. Evelyn could have turned around. She could have pulled the door shut, gone back to her notebook, back to the list of urgent things already stacked too high. She had more than enough weight on her without adding another ounce. She held still one more breath. Then she stepped inside. Against the far wall, at the very back, stood a row of large wooden crates draped beneath a heavy tarp. They weren't tossed in with the rest of the wreckage. They sat in a neat, deliberate line, as if someone had placed them there with clear purpose and then walked away without returning. She moved closer. Her fingers touched the tarp. Dust lifted gently, less than she'd expected. She pulled the covering down with one hand. Underneath were glass jars. Evelyn straightened. For several seconds she did absolutely nothing. The jars sat in careful rows, 4 or 5 to a row, more than 24 altogether. But it was the faded handwriting on the labels that stopped her cold. The metal lids had gone dark with age, but remained sealed. The paper labels pasted along the outside had softened, their ink thinning year by year, but the words were still legible. She bent down, lifted one jar. The glass was cold against her skin, heavier than she'd guessed. Inside, something dark brown, edging toward red, thickened by time. She brought it closer. Her eyes locked on the handwritten line across the label. Blue Porch Fig Preserve. Mabel Louise Harper. Savannah, Georgia. She didn't move again. Her grandmother's name resting in her palm. In the middle of a room locked shut for 8 years, in a city where Evelyn had never imagined she'd end up. She didn't set the jar down, not yet. She held it just like that, reading every word once more, slowly, as though reading too fast might make the letters dissolve. She hadn't seen that name written out in a very long time. Evelyn had grown up in the kitchen behind a small wooden house in Savannah, where summer always arrived a little earlier and held on a little longer. Her grandmother never used the word products. They were fig preserve, chutney jars of glass, lined up on wooden shelves. People came for them, paid or didn't, depending on the season. Mabel didn't keep careful records, but everything she made carried its own rhythm, its own method, its own scent that Evelyn could identify before she even crossed the threshold. Faintly spiced, deeply sweet. And beneath that, some layer she had never been able to name, not once in all her years. She placed the jar down, then dragged the tarp fully aside. There was far more than she'd expected. The wooden crates didn't hold just a few dozen jars. They were lined with paper, stacked in careful layers, every layer composed of identical jars. Some labels had blurred with time, others remained sharp, but every single one bore the same name. Evelyn dropped to her knees. Her hands moved faster now. She was no longer standing there staring. She began pulling open each crate, checking every layer. In one corner, tucked beneath the final jars, she found a bundle of papers bound with string. She drew it out. The paper had gone yellow, but hadn't rotted through. Letters, handwritten invoices. Brief notes. One recipient's name appeared over and over again, Nadine Porter. She turned each sheet. The dates spanned years, many years. The lines spoke of quantities, the quality of individual batches, which ones needed more time, which had reached their peak. These were not the records of someone doing this as a hobby. This was a chain of exchange, systematic, regular, sustained across decades. Evelyn turned to the back of the bundle. At the bottom sat thicker documents, typed, signed. She pulled them free and spread them across her knees. Her eyes slowed. She read each line as though handling something fragile. The name Mabel Louise Harper appeared at the top. Below it, the terms: ownership rights, production rights, distribution rights, and one line where her gaze came to rest longer than on any other, and to her direct heirs. Evelyn did not keep reading, not right away. She held that page. Her eyes stayed on the final phrase. Her hand didn't shake. She simply sat there, among wooden crates, glass jars, and something she had not yet called opportunity or anything else. Outside, kitchen metal clinked softly as wind pushed through the back door. She still hadn't risen. The next morning, Evelyn carried the entire file to the law office on Meeting Street in a rough canvas tote with worn handles. She arrived 15 minutes early, sat in the reception area, watched through glass doors as cars crawled in a slow line through the intersection. Charleston in the late morning had a way of looking elegant and exhausted at the same time, like a city long practiced at keeping up appearances while something inside crumbled piece by piece. Evelyn set the bag on her lap. Both hands rested still on top of it. She didn't open her notebook, didn't reach for her phone. She waited. The lawyer's name was Diane Mercer, 52, dry in manner but not cold. She led Evelyn into her office, drew the documents from the bag, and began reading them in sequence. Not skimming, not rushing. Every letter, every invoice, every contract. Evelyn sat across from her, both hands flat on her knees, watching the black fountain pen in Diane's grip travel slowly along the margins of each page, as though she were tracing the outline of something valuable. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she reached the end. Diane placed the documents on the desk, removed her glasses, looked directly at Evelyn. Diane nodded once. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She absorbed every word, as though it came from a language she had always known, but had never once heard spoken on her behalf. Diane slid the contract section slightly forward. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 5 underscore underscore. Outside the door, a printer hummed to life and fell silent again. Evelyn dipped her chin. Quote 6, quote 7. Diane spread open her planner. Quote 8. Later that same afternoon, back at the restaurant, the phone rang. Claire's name burned across the screen so bright that Evelyn had to squint just to read it. She stood beside the worn wooden counter, let it ring a few beats longer than necessary, then picked up. "Are you at the restaurant?" Claire's voice floated through, light, easy, as though nothing had ever passed between them that should make either woman careful. 13. Claire lobbed a handful of small questions: the electrician, the permits, whether the water line needed replacing. Tiny, weightless questions, spaced with the exact rhythm of someone filling air for the sake of filling it. Then her tone shifted, just barely. Evelyn stared into the darkness pooling at the far end of the kitchen. Claire went quiet for 2 full seconds. Evelyn tightened her grip on the phone. Claire hadn't said anything wrong. That was the most remarkable thing about her, had been since childhood. She never asked directly for what she wanted to know. She circled and circled until the other person laid the information out between them with their own hands. Never even realizing what they'd just given away, Evelyn said. A soft, brief laugh from the other end. The call ended shortly after. Evelyn placed the phone on the counter and went back to measuring the gap between the stove and the prep area. She wrote the number down in her notebook. The front door of the restaurant swung wide and clapped shut. A tall white man in a pale blue shirt stood framed in the doorway, scanning the interior. Mid-50s, gray threading both temples. His jacket hung loose over one arm. The kind of man who walked into a room without raising his voice, and everyone still knew he'd arrived. "Mrs. Cole?" Evelyn set her pen down. "I'm Julian Mercer." She knew that name instantly. Mercer Table, Mercer Provisions, Mercer Southern Pantry. His face had turned up in food magazines, business journals, every kind of publication that covered the craft food world. A man who'd begun with a single food counter in Macon, then built it outward into an entire chain, handcrafted southern goods, premium packaging, regional distribution across half the southeast. Julian crossed the floor slowly and placed a business card on the counter in front of her. Evelyn glanced at the card but didn't touch it. "What brings you to me?" "Blue Porch Fig Preserve." He spoke that name the way a person speaks something they've rehearsed in their own mind 100 times before ever saying it out loud. Julian paused. His gaze drifted past her toward the empty kitchen. Evelyn rested her weight against the counter's edge. "Are you here to buy it?" "No." He shook his head once. "I didn't drive more than 200 miles to acquire a name outright. I came to find out whether the heir understands what she's holding." She studied him for a moment. "I'm not entirely sure yet." Julian nodded, slowly, deliberately, as if that were the precise answer he'd been hoping to hear. __quote_36___. He asked if he could return the following morning with a summary of what his team had pulled together. No pressure applied, no figure floated, not a single word about contracts. But as he reached the door, Julian paused and turned back with a question Evelyn hadn't braced for. "What did your grandmother's kitchen smell like on hot days?" The answer left her mouth before thought could catch it. Ripe figs, apple vinegar, brown sugar, and something spicier than people guessed. Julian held still for one long breath, then nodded. "I'll be back at 10. He walked out. The door settled shut behind him, a small, precise click. Evelyn picked up her pen again. She did not write. The phone on the counter buzzed once more. Not Claire, not the lawyer. The screen displayed a name she had scrubbed from every routine, but never from the deeper place where memory lives. Richard Cole. Evelyn let it ring through. Let it fall to silence. Seconds later, the screen glowed again. Same name. She stared at it without reaching. Richard had always possessed a talent for reappearing at the exact moment something started taking shape without him. For 32 years, he had almost never walked into a room while things were still messy. He waited. Waited until the table was set, the guests seated, the contract drawn up. Only then did he step in, as though the entire scene had been his doing all along. The divorce followed that same pattern. Evelyn answered on the third call. "It's me," Richard said, low, even, unhurried. That voice had once convinced other people he was a man of self-control, a man of judgment, a man who carried dignity through difficult moments. Evelyn knew the truth. It was only the voice of someone who had never been forced to pay immediately for anything he'd done. She said. She waved toward the counter. Richard paused, brief, calculated. She pulled out a chair and sat down as those words landed. His method of selecting language had not changed. He never stated what he wanted outright. He only constructed a frame of words, so others had to step inside it themselves. Evelyn said. The line went noticeably quieter. When Richard spoke again, his voice remained soft, only a fraction lower. Evelyn looked through the front window of the restaurant. Across the street, a delivery man pushed a cart stacked with soft drink crates along the sidewalk. A young couple passed with a small child between them. The city carried on with its ordinary business, while the man, who had shared more than half her life, tried to lay his hand back on something that no longer belonged to him. 50, she said. She offered nothing. She ended the call. That afternoon, Diane Mercer sent an email. The petition establishing inheritance rights and the right to use the brand had been filed. A handful of items still required supplementation, all to be completed within the next 3 days. At the bottom of the email sat one line, shorter than all the rest. 55__. The following morning, Julian Mercer arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, precisely as promised. He carried a thin, cream-colored folder and a box of photographic copies. He did not come alone. The young woman beside him introduced herself as Lina, heritage brand researcher at his company. They didn't enter the restaurant like people who had come to talk an owner into signing. They laid the documents out across the table near the window, carefully, deliberately, the way people open a family file that had been missing for a very long time. Lina pushed photocopied menus across the table toward Evelyn. 3 different restaurants, Savannah and Beaufort, dating back to the 1990s. Beside listings for cured meats, buttermilk biscuits, and baked cheese, sat small handwritten annotations. Served with Blue Porch fig preserve. A clipping from a local magazine, 1998, described a lightly spiced fig preserve crafted by Mabel Harper, something a handful of chefs in the region still quietly pursued. Then a business card from a specialty shop in Augusta, its corners soft and wrinkled with age. On the back, a few rushed words in faded ink. __, quote _ 56 __. Evelyn touched the yellowed edge with her fingertips. She had never known her grandmother's work had traveled that far from the small kitchen behind the house. Julian sat across from her. Both hands flat on the table, perfectly still. I do not need to convince you this can be sold. You're old enough to understand commercial value when you see it. What I'm telling you is that it carries more than that. It carries history. It carries absence. And now, it carries a living heir. What do you want from me? Evelyn asked. A real partnership, Julian said. The name stays yours. The formula stays yours. The right to decide stays yours. I bring production infrastructure, a distribution chain, legal support, and the experience to reintroduce this to market without turning it into counterfeit memory merchandise. And this restaurant, if you want to reopen it, reopen it. If you want the brand and the restaurant tied together even. He gestured toward the kitchen. Then, let silence fill the space long enough for the conversation to shed its transactional weight. Julian glanced around the room. Do you really plan to cook here? Yes. Then do not let other people redesign this place until it cannot recognize itself. After they left, Evelyn dialed Sharon Bell from the old number still saved in her phone. 2 attempts before someone picked up. Sharon spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when bad news usually arrives before the first sentence finishes landing. Sharon, this is Evelyn. A bit of silence on the other end. Yes, ma'am? I am renovating a diner in Charleston. I need someone who knows how to manage a dining room, who reads people, who keeps order without stripping anyone of their dignity. I also need someone who will not lie to me. Sharon exhaled, barely audible. Are you offering me a job? If you will take it. Do you know where I am right now? Buckhead, a small hotel on Piedmont, morning shift. That is right. The pay is better than what you have there. There is insurance. Your name goes on the staff board, not hidden behind someone else's. On the other end, the sound of a vacuum cleaner drifted down a hallway and faded. Sharon did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice set lower, not trembling. Held tight. I tried to tell you. I know, I did not have proof then. You still said it. Sharon asked for 1 day to settle things. Evelyn agreed. The call ended. She opened her email again and found a new message from Diane Mercer, sent less than 7 minutes before. The subject line held only 4 words. Petition filed this afternoon. Evelyn opened it. Richard Cole, acting through legal counsel, had formally requested the court review Blue Porch Fig Preserve as an asset containing elements that arose during the period of marital dissolution, eligible for inclusion in the supplemental division. Attached to the petition was a chain of messages and notes confirming the discovery of the brand and restaurant documents. Most of it drawn from communications provided by Claire. Evelyn read the entire petition twice. Then she printed every page on the old machine wedged into the corner of the counter. Each sheet emerged slowly. A thin stack, but enough for a person to understand that certain attacks do not need volume to make the air in a room feel poisoned. She clipped the pages together, slid them into a file folder. Drove to Diane's office that same afternoon. Diane had already reviewed the electronic copy before Evelyn walked through the door. She did not direct her client to the reception area. Instead, she led her straight to the small meeting room in the back. An oval wooden table, 2 glasses of water, a narrow window facing the parking lot. Nothing in that space was designed to impress, only to make words land clean. Quote 76_ Diane said, flipping the file open to the appendix. 77, 78. Diane pressed her finger against the edge of the final page. 79. Evelyn sat straight, taking in every syllable. Claire had handed them everything. 80 said nothing more. What was printed on paper needed no added weight. A chain of messages between Claire and Richard's attorney had been reproduced and clipped into the file. Timestamps spaced by days, by weeks, stretching from the moment Evelyn purchased the restaurant to the moment she filed the inheritance claim. Claire hadn't fabricated a thing. She had simply passed along what her mother shared during phone conversations that were supposed to be family calls. Diane closed the folder. 3 days later, Evelyn walked into the courtroom, wearing the old cream-colored jacket she'd worn to Ethan's final parent-teacher conference in high school. Not for the memory, only because it fit, drew no attention, and didn't require her to waste thought on one more decision. Richard sat across the aisle with his attorney and Ethan. Navy suit, narrow striped tie, carrying that near-flawless composure of a man who had spent decades entering rooms as though the outcome had already bent his way. Ethan looked older than 37. Not in his hair or his face, in the tension pulling at the edges of his mouth, in the way his shoulders locked too stiffly. He never glanced toward his mother, He cycled between his phone, the documents, his phone again, the restless rhythm of someone who believed he could still steer things as long as his hands stayed occupied. The hearing ran shorter than Richard had planned for. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a level voice and a face that revealed almost nothing, read through the original contract language, compared the brand registration date against Evelyn's marriage date, then asked Richard's attorney on what precise grounds he believed a separately inherited asset could become contested property simply because it surfaced late. The attorney pivoted toward the angle of newly emerging commercial value, toward the need for extended review based on concealment concerns, toward the trail of information supplied by the daughter. The judge listened through all of it without a single interruption. When he finished, she looked down at the file once more, then set her pen aside. There is no basis. 4 words. Richard's lawyer was already drawing breath to request supplementation, but the judge had continued, one bit slower than before. This brand was established independently prior to the marriage. Inheritance rights belong to Mrs. Cole under the original documentation. The court finds no evidence of asset commingling and no disclosure obligation breached based on what has been presented. The request for supplemental review is denied. The hearing closed almost immediately after. Richard did not turn toward Evelyn. He tilted his head toward his lawyer, spoke something very brief, then gathered his papers. Ethan rose more slowly. A pen slipped from his hand and struck the stone floor. The sharp plastic crack rang through a room that was already nearly hollow. 4 days later, the first article surfaced in the local business section. It wasn't about the fig preserve brand. It was about the dismissed dispute filing and the names that appeared in the appendix. Names connected to several older transactions tied to Cole Development. A reporter started pulling threads from the legal structure in this case into other files. 2 weeks later, a federal investigative office issued a records preservation request to Richard's company. Ethan's call came early Friday afternoon. No pleasantries. No warmth circling the edges of his voice before landing on what he actually wanted. Did you say anything to anyone? No. Did you give your lawyer anything beyond the brand file? No. Has anyone from an investigative agency contacted you yet? Silence hung on the line for a few seconds. Then Ethan pressed again, something tighter threading through his words. If they do contact you, what will you say? The truth. He exhaled hard through his nose. You always think everything is that simple. No. I just stopped helping other people make it more complicated. Ethan hung up without a goodbye. That same week, Sharon arrived in Charleston. Small gray suitcase, 2 pairs of work shoes wrapped in cloth bags. She showed up at the restaurant door at 7 in the morning, hair pulled back clean, white blouse pressed, and carrying none of the uncertainty of someone coming to ask for work. She carried the bearing of a woman who had already decided. Evelyn walked her through the new floor plan, the counter area, table placements, where the register would sit, where the shift board would hang. Sharon moved through the space once and asked exactly the questions that mattered. How many kitchen staff? Whether servers would rotate by shift or hold fixed schedules? Which door would handle deliveries? Whether the customer restroom would be finished before the soft opening? Neither of them mentioned the old house in Atlanta. Neither of them mentioned the way Sharon had left. By late morning, as they were checking the standing refrigerator one more time, Evelyn's phone lit up with a message from a number she didn't recognize. 1 sentence. I'm Daniel Whitman, Claire's husband. I think you should know what my wife sent to her father. Evelyn did not reply right away. She placed the phone face down on the stainless steel counter and kept working through the delivery list with Sharon until the morning was done. 24 deep plates, 18 baking trays, 4 boxes of cloth towels, 2 produce suppliers who needed callbacks because their delivery window ran later than promised. Everything concrete, tangible, measurable. She worked through each task one by one until there was nothing left standing between her and that call. Early afternoon. She walked to the back of the restaurant, stood by the delivery door. Dialed Daniel Whitman's number. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was worn thin, brief, stripped of the social polish people usually layer on when speaking to a mother-in-law for the first time. Mrs. Cole. Yes, I don't know the right way to make this call anymore. Daniel paused, then continued. I read the file attached to the email the lawyer sent Claire. Then I kept going through her phone. I think you need to see what I saw. He didn't explain further. He simply sent screenshots, one after another, while they were still on the line. Claire's messages to Richard. To Richard's lawyer, to some assistant at the office. The dates and timestamps stretched across months. Mom is checking the back room again. Mom says there are papers. Mom has called a lawyer. Mom met someone named Julian Mercer this morning. This looks bigger than we thought. Evelyn watched each image arrive on her screen. No apology between the lines. No hesitation. Just information being passed along, steadily, neatly, efficiently. Like inventory. Like a delivery list of her own mother's movements. Daniel continued. I'm not calling to ask you to forgive her. I'm calling because I have 2 daughters, and I just realized what my wife has been doing to her own mother for months. Where is she? Evelyn asked. At our house. Not for much longer, though. He exhaled. I spoke to my own lawyer this morning. Evelyn saved every image into a separate folder, forwarded them to Diane Mercer. 5 minutes later, Diane replied with exactly one sentence. Keep everything. Do not respond to Claire in writing. The next 3 weeks moved in a dense, tight rhythm. The diner began to take real shape beneath their hands. Walls repainted a pale cream. The wooden surface of the bar counter sanded smooth, then sealed with fresh oil. The industrial stove, 2 burners replaced, ventilation system repaired. Sharon hired staff her own way. She didn't pick the ones who talked fastest. She chose the ones who looked straight ahead. The ones who listened to the full question before opening their mouths to answer. Evelyn stood beside the temporary head chef, working through Mabel's notebook, recipe by recipe. They tested and retested, adjusting brown sugar ratios, dialing back apple vinegar, adding another pinch of mustard seeds, recalibrating black pepper until the balance held. Julian Mercer appeared in Charleston nearly every week. He didn't always arrive carrying documents or fresh proposals. Some visits, he walked in with nothing but a box of sample glass jars. Wide mouth or narrow mouth, which did Evelyn prefer for the first production run of the preserve? Other days he settled into the table by the window, tasting 3 versions of the same recipe one after another. The best one, he'd say, was still whichever version made a person pause mid-bite. Something familiar rising up that they couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, the investigation file circling Richard refused to sit still. Word spread past the local pages. A law firm out of Columbia filed suit on behalf of 2 former partners of Cole Development. The allegation that the transfer and asset preservation structure embedded in earlier deals showed deliberate signs of concealing the real beneficial interests. Ethan's name surfaced across multiple appendices. His signature sat on documents that until now nobody had bothered to examine closely. He called Evelyn one more time. His voice had gone hoarse. Mom, you really can't do anything. She stood in the kitchen. One hand gripped a wooden spoon. The other pinned the phone between shoulder and ear. What are you asking me to do? Stop them. Make it clear that this didn't start with you. That you're not involved. If I'm not involved, then I'll say I'm not involved. But they're tracing into the old part too. The old part is where you put your signature. Silence from Ethan. She could hear the air conditioner grinding hard on his end. A late office. A row of lit cubicles. A 37-year-old man arriving at the understanding that paperwork does not always protect the person who signs it. Dad says you'd want to see us collapse. Your father has always believed everything revolves around what other people want for him. Ethan did not call again. Claire called on Sunday evening, just after the test kitchen had gone dark. Sharon Bell was out at the counter tallying glasses and cups. Evelyn looked at her daughter's name glowing on the screen. Then she stepped into the backyard before answering. Wind carried the smell of brackish water from the harbor's direction. Full dark hadn't settled yet. "Mom?" Claire said. That single word told Evelyn everything. That her daughter's life had shifted off its old foundations. Not because regret had softened her voice, because for the first time, Claire was no longer speaking from a position of safety. "What is it Daniel knows?" Evelyn said nothing. "He checked my phone. He read everything." Claire swallowed dryly. "He's already moved into another room. Tomorrow morning I have to meet with a lawyer." "Is that so? Don't talk like that, Mom." Claire's voice thinned, sharpened with urgency. "I was only trying to keep everything from getting worse. Dad said if a new asset appeared and no one controlled it, then the legal side would drag on, and you would end up losing more. You're 34 years old." Claire fell silent. Adults cannot keep calling what they do being led forever. "You don't understand." "I understand very clearly." On the other end, quick breathing, then a door slamming shut. Maybe Claire stood in her apartment parking lot. Maybe she had turned her back on her own home to call her mother for the first time, not to extract information, but to find somewhere to lean. "I need a place to stay for a few days," Claire said. "Just a few days." Evelyn gazed across the backyard, growing darker, where crates of produce would arrive the next morning. "When I needed a place to stay, you did not call." Claire started to speak, but Evelyn had already ended the call. 2 days later, she drove to a nursing home in North Charleston to meet Nadine Porter. The 83-year-old woman was smaller than Evelyn had imagined. But her eyes were still bright. Her memory still sharp enough to recognize the name, Mabel Harper, in the very first sentence of introduction. Nadine sat motionless for a long while after Evelyn said she was Mabel's granddaughter. She didn't ask again, didn't question it. She only placed her thin hand on the arm of her chair and looked straight at Evelyn, like someone who had waited far too long for news and had finally stopped hoping it would come. "I kept those jars because I couldn't bear to throw away something Mabel made with her own hands," Nadine said. "When the restaurant closed, I was going to call her. By the time I found the number, people told me she was very ill. Then, not long after that, she died. I didn't know who I was supposed to give them to." They sat together for close to 2 hours. Nadine spoke about deliveries wrapped in old cloth, about how Mabel always wrote the cooking date on every lid, about how she had never once agreed to raise the price, even when Nadine insisted customers would gladly pay more. Before she left, Evelyn told Nadine she wanted to arrange a monthly payment from the restaurant's profits once the doors opened. Nadine's face tightened, ready to refuse. Evelyn said only one thing: "You kept them for me for 8 years." That evening, when she returned to the restaurant, Sharon was hanging the temporary shift board on the wall near the counter. Staff names lined up in black ink, straight as a ruler. At the very top, the front of house manager position, Sharon Bell. Opening morning started before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops. Sharon arrived at 5:30, hair pulled into a tight bun, a stack of invoices pressed under one arm, a pencil tucked behind her ear, like she had owned this space for years. Bread delivery showed up before 6. Vegetables came 15 minutes after that. Buttercream, bacon, cornmeal, eggs, apple vinegar, brown sugar. The first glass jars of Glue Porch fig preserve, a small batch meant for the counter, were carried inside in such deliberate order that the kitchen already sounded alive before all the lights had even been switched on. Evelyn stood at the prep table.
Apron cinched tighter on her waist. She checked the sauce again for the slow-roasted meat. Behind her on the stove, the preserve pot simmered gently over low flame. The smell built in layers: ripe figs, cinnamon, cloves, apple vinegar, black pepper, each one deepening, then folding into the scent of hot butter and onions hitting cast iron. Marisol, a young prep cook slicing onions at the far end, lifted her head and said softly, "There are already people lining up out there." Sharon didn't look up from the reservation board. "The doors open at 11. If they came early, they can wait." At 10 minutes to 10, Julian Mercer walked through the front door. No flowers, no wine, just a wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. He passed straight by the still empty tables into the kitchen and set it down on the stainless steel counter. "I thought this should be here from the beginning." Evelyn peeled the paper back. Inside was the photograph she had lent Julian the day before so it could be scanned. Mabel Harper standing in front of the old porch in Savannah. Short-sleeved dress, hair rolled neatly up. Holding 2 jars of preserve in both hands, smiling the way a person smiles when they don't need to explain something they know is good. The new frame was simple: pale oak, clear glass. No ornate border, no nameplate. Evelyn picked it up, studied it for a long breath, then told Marisol to watch the sauce for 2 minutes. She carried the photograph out herself, walked it to the wall beside the kitchen door, the spot where everyone entering the dining room would see it first. Sharon handed her the small hammer and the nail she had already prepared. Nobody said a word. The photograph was hung at eye level. When the doors opened, the line on the sidewalk already reached past half the storefront. Some were neighborhood people who had walked by for weeks watching the renovation unfold and finally came to see for themselves. Some were guests from downtown who had caught the restaurant's name through a brief post about a southern kitchen bringing back a lost fig preserve recipe. 2 older couples had driven all the way from Savannah, drawn by the name Blue Porch in a small article Julian had written. 15 minutes after opening, every table was occupied. Sharon moved through the dining room as though every chair corner and every gap between tables had been calibrated to the rhythm of her stride. She straightened water glasses, pulled an extra seat to a table of 4, guided an elderly couple closer to the window because the husband struggled to hear when seated near the bar. The servers fell into a steadier cadence. Order chimes rang across the kitchen in quick succession. The sound of pots and pans, oven doors swinging open and shut, people calling out to one another in short, clear phrases that served no real purpose except to prove they were all here, all moving, all part of something alive. In the thick of that first rush, Diane Mercer walked in alongside a man in a gray shirt, no tie. They took the last table by the wall. Evelyn barely managed a nod while her hands kept plating. Near the end of the meal, Diane stepped into the kitchen, set a thin envelope on the edge of the table, spoke just loud enough to cut through the hum of the ventilation. The federal prosecutors had officially opened a file on Richard Cole and several connected coal development transactions. Ethan was not facing charges at this time, but his professional standing was, for all practical purposes, finished. Richard had lost 2 major investors that morning. I thought you should know. Evelyn gave a single nod. Thank you. Diane glanced toward the packed dining room beyond the kitchen door. Guests passing around sample jars of Blue Porch fig preserve sat in the center of each table like artifacts that were somehow both deeply familiar and entirely new. You have other things to do today. She walked back out. Lunch bled into early afternoon without a single real pause. A local food critic sat alone at a two-top near the entrance, ordered biscuits, pan-seared chicken, asked for a jar of preserve to carry home. A group of older women gathered beneath Mabel's photograph on the wall and stayed there a long time before anyone seated them. One turned to Sharon Bell
and asked if that was the owner's grandmother. Sharon answered without hesitation. She is the reason this place exists. Somewhere around 3, Evelyn's phone buzzed inside her apron pocket. Her hands were too full. More than an hour passed before the first wave finally eased and the kitchen narrowed down to take-out orders. She pulled the phone free. 3 missed calls from Richard, 1 from Claire. 1 voicemail she hadn't heard. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, then pressed mute, set the phone on the high shelf above the spice rack, where it could sit with the things she no longer needed to reach for. By the time the last guests pushed back from their chairs, the sun had shifted away from the front windows. Glasses gathered, cups stacked, the floor swept for the first time since morning. Sharon was counting the afternoon register with the new hire, while Marisol wiped down every surface of the stove. Julian leaned against the frame of the back doorway, jacket draped loosely across his shoulders, watching the final handful of people drift out onto the sidewalk. Evelyn washed her hands at the steel sink, dried them slowly, stepped forward to stand at the threshold between kitchen and dining room. From there she could see everything. Tables that had been used hard, napkins still half folded, evening light settling into the grain of the wood, Mabel's photograph steady on the wall. Sharon bent low over columns of numbers, servers laughing quietly with one another after a first day that had never once let up. And on every table, a jar of Blue Porch fig preserve with its lid already opened. Nobody in that room needed to know that Richard had once taken the house, the accounts, the signatures. Nobody needed to hear how many years Evelyn had lived inside the life where her name appeared nowhere at all. This room had not been built from those things. It stood here because of an old kitchen in Savannah. A woman who had cooked figs over a stove decades ago. A stack of papers lying still in the dark, and a door at the back of the kitchen that Evelyn had pushed open on the exact day she had nothing left to lose. Not one person who ate here tonight stopped to ask what had come before they walked in. Not one needed a long explanation for why this flavor was sitting on their table. Each of them carried away a story of their own, left holding a memory of their own. And behind them remained a space that went on existing without needing to prove a single thing more. If you stayed with the story long enough to see what truly remains when everything seems lost, thank you. If someone comes to mind who needs to hear it, send it their way. And if you want to keep finding stories like this one, subscribe so the next one finds you.